the pedagogic project isn't just about corporate loyalty, institutional loyalty. It's a far bigger cause in a way, and it's about understanding that independent of what one is hired to do, that our responsibilities towards each other, it transcends institutions, it transcends nations, it transcends political agendas, it transcends validations. So, you know, it's all about moving beyond I would say, the kind of the parameters of the corporatization of education and the expectations placed by capitalism on employees regarding notions of loyalty, which is always incredibly one way, isn't it? You know, we work long hours, we're not paid properly, we're not paid overtime, we're not given enough staff, budget, resources, whatever. And of course, yet our loyalty is demanded of us, but there's no such loyalty towards us within the current system. You know, it doesn't work like that. There's no reciprocity regarding being cared for by the institution, if you see what I mean, or cared for. And it's not an institutional problem, I should emphasize. This isn't, you can go anywhere, you can go to the most caring institutions led by brilliant people. But the challenge is always going to be that the broader infrastructure of neo-capitalism makes all of our institutions, you know, uninhabitable to some extent if we prioritize ethical processes and caring communities, because those things cannot.
I mean, you were so encouraging. I honestly, that's one thing that I remember, and it's you know, I felt so motivated by your words. It was really, I guess that's one thing you are left with, to encourage and to empower.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, and also I should say that students like you, I mean, it's always important to understand that there's never, coming back to this point in a way of reciprocity, meeting students like you, having a chance to work with students like you, you know, that's what kind of makes educators want to work. Because a lot of the times, materially, you know, working in education is really, really tough. It's a public sector job that's been privatized with no premium on that privatization. Because if we look back to, you know, Thatcher's arguments for wholesale privatization of public services, the arguments were that it would be efficient, it would reduce cost margins, and it would, you know, benefit employees because they would have access to, you know, enhanced pay and other things. And the fact of it, which we knew all along, you know, even when it was happening, we knew that it was going to go a certain way. Instead, what you have is, you know, a kind of expansion of responsibility, reduction in funding, a far more exploitative context in which people work. There's kind of less money to do more. And in fact, you know, there's ostensibly no reward system other than really just producing books, articles, and teaching 24/7 in order to survive. Sorry, that's the dog alarm. Hi, Adam. So I'm just mid-interview. This is the domestic reality of being a teen. But anyway,
I know.
So it's kind of fun to have that in the podcast.
Is there something you have to do, or?
No, that Adam's very, very kindly, Adam Elstein, he's my colleague and a superstar at Pratt, so he's just come in to give him a bit of a name drop in the podcast, but he's just come in to get the dogs out. So hopefully.
Excellent. So it's a real domestic environment at Pratt.
Well, it is in many ways, but I mean, today we're not allowed in because of the snow. But this point about reciprocity, I mean, you know, this thing about students and students like you, ostensibly, you know, being able to have that level of conversation, being able to sort of understand the potential of what architecture education could do just by having a conversation with a really bright and talented, you know, young architecture student. That's it feeds us, you know, there's a sort of sense of understanding, you know, you can get when you read essays.
It's a two-way process, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's that sense of actually understanding the possibilities and also remembering that, you know, architecture, because it's so mutable and so unstable, because it's, you know, the love child of many disciplines and epistemologies, and it's always incredibly sensitive to market forces, you know, which is why it's always one of the worst affected sectors in recessions and so on, and evidently pandemics. All of those, if you like, instabilities are what make understanding what the future of architecture is a very kind of I would say a very adaptive and a very kind of iterative conversation. It never feels like there's a fixed point of destination. There's always a sense. This instability is something that I think makes those conversations so critical, because all the time the students operate in many ways like some sort of weather vane. They offer a feedback device, almost like a space probe or something, because there they are living out pedagogical ideas and validation criterias and all that sort of thing. And then it's how they engage with that material that really orients you as to whether stuff remains relevant, whether it remains inclusive, which is obviously a big part of the conversation now. and relevant to whom, to what? To serve industry as is, to serve society's capitalist infrastructure as is, or to actually, if you like, glimpse an alternative reality. And that's why I think, my conversations with you were very memorable, because there was a sense of always thinking, wow, I can see possibilities for architecture in the way that you are
as a
resisting
profession, maybe as well.
The brief. Yeah, exactly, precisely that, definitely.
Oh, that's fantastic. I mean, that's well. You see where it led me to realizing that actually we need to have more conversations, and less, I guess, less hours spent in front of a computer drawing lines.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, and this is a fascinating thing you just mentioned, and it actually resonates with me, because I often think about whether, I have a feeling that we're either looking back or looking forward, right? We're either looking into the past or we're looking into the future, but somehow we don't really work with the present. And I have a feeling that what you're just now trying to say, the argument you're trying to make, is that it's the present that we need to kind of listen to.
Well, certainly that. I mean, I think that one of the challenges has always been with architecture is that it's never really been a true discipline, because it's an amalgamation of so many others. In fact, it's a brilliant synthesizer. And in a way, one would argue that it's inherently interdisciplinary because of that. But of course, not all disciplines. And let's remind ourselves, if we step back from even that comment for a moment, who defines disciplines? Who defines epistemologies? And if we, historically, it's been a bunch of old white guys, which is totally fine. White guys have a place at the table along with everybody else. But there's never really been any kind of revision as to what constitutes a discipline or what constitutes epistemology. Here we are thinking that it's radical and progressive to have conversations about interdisciplinarity, intradisciplinarity, transdisciplinarity. And until we exhaust ourselves with prefixes, I mean, one wonders where this is going to go, right? And when in fact, the bigger conversation is like, why construct the notion of a discipline at all? And it comes in a way, and I think that even that concept transposes very neatly into understanding, by implication, what is architecture? Because if disciplines are up for grabs, what defines them, what they're comprised of, never mind the kind of the future application, the past definition, and as you said, what the present application is of these terminologies and these constraints, the way that they operate as a coded system that within higher education, and frankly also within wider society, partitions thinking. It segregates its silos, and in a way, in doing that, it debilitates our ability to respond to the seismic changes we're facing within the world. So I think that what architecture can do, in a funny kind of way, as this kind of, love child of a polyamorous marriage, is kind of sit at the heart of that conversation and say, actually having the vantage point across all of these disciplines, across all these ways of doing things, where else can a much more open conversation about our responsibilities, responsibility, right? So the response to the crises, the response to the climate collapse, the response to the pandemic, but our ability to respond, responsibility, really is predicated on the notion of divorcing any preconceived notions of what disciplinarity really is. So as much as I love to have conversations for the purposes of grant applications and for the purposes of worried parents about the virtues of an interdisciplinary degree, that's kindergarten talk to me. I think the far more advanced conversation is really about understanding, which is something I've obviously argued along with Rory Hyde and Roberto Maracaccio in our last book, Architects After Architecture. That, we need to understand that what we have here as a skill set, as a set of behaviors also, is a far more rarefied and advantageous viewpoint on application of knowledge across present contexts, across challenges that sit outside of what we conventionally define as architectural production. And if we actually release ourselves from the bind of, I would suggest, an overinvestment in the title architects, and also, or the willingness to uphold a notion of what architecture is that's very limited and is principally focused on production of buildings rather than far more radical or important solutions sometimes, then we're debilitating ourselves. We talk all the time in architecture, and it drives me nuts, about protectionism, aka protection of title, role, and the issues with that. I think that is, coming back to your point about history, such a tired old debate. I'm no longer interested in having it. For me, it's far more about saying, how do we expand the boundaries? Never mind standing there on the edge of our little island. It's a bit of a Brexit analogy in a way, I suppose, with our tiny little, sovereign cutlasses, waving them at, marauding foreigners. Conceptually, we need to start saying, where else do we go? And it's not about colonizing other disciplines or colonizing other industries. It's about just divorcing the idea of there even being nationhood, there even being the nation of architects, but moving into something that's far more porous, far more generous, far less contrived on notions of these boundaries, which are colonial concepts anyway.
So who do we have
to concept.
Who do we have to confront to do that? Are we supposed to abolish institutions, educational institutions, professional institutions, ARB, RIBA, AIA?
Well, you know, architects are traditionally profoundly narcissistic. So I think we start with an existential crisis, and immediately, ideally, one where we look critically at ourselves and how we choose to define ourselves. But this question of value that comes up again, which is tied to this, you know, definition of, or the protection of title and the protection of role. We always say people don't value what we do, it's why we get paid less. Well, there's a few misapprehensions about number one. One of the reasons we get paid less is because we need fewer bodies in the building to produce architecture than we did 10 years ago, principally because of technology. So what we know from Bank of England statistics, that nearly a third of the UK workforce within the next decade, their roles will be entirely automated. What does that mean? It's why people are arguing for a living wage, so you don't have to work in order to survive, because it's not going to be possible for everybody to be meaningfully employed if machines are doing 1/3 of the workforce within the next decade. And that's exactly why architecture, so much of what was defined a decade ago as architectural production is now, quite frankly, a lot of it was tedious anyway, but a lot of it's being done by BIM or other machine systems, other machine learning systems and artificial intelligence. So I think we are, whether we like it or not, we can, you know, we are going to be confronting, because of that advanced AI threat, or in my view, opportunity, a new definition of what architects do. So I think that's where we begin. We begin by saying, can we stop running conveyor belts, factories for architectural practice as is? Can we start to allow schools the breathing room by reconsidering what validation criteria is? Because that's the big stick and carrot here, you know. And actually allow some room for speculation, some room to encourage students to think about the application of architectural thinking beyond the field as it stands, and actually to start to use the school as a speculation space. The interesting thing about universities is many of them were set up, you know, in a way you could look at traditions across Europe, especially in the 17th century, and, you know, and obviously its relationship to the Enlightenment, not just to understand behaviors and to create a kind of philosophies and theories that were, if you like, departitioned from religious values and religious dogma into this much more speculative space of why do we do these things, why do bodies work in this way, why do we behave in these ways, what are the theories of existence? And that's really where you see the birth of modern philosophy, I think. But what's interesting is universities also, and this was certainly true of Germany, used that space as a means to direct industry as to what it should do next. So the tradition, was very much around saying a university is intended to give a mandate to industry about where it should focus its energies, not to sort of prepare people for an existing workforce, because frankly, Germany would just be we'd all still be driving around in horse and cart, right? But to actually sort of create a space for speculation that would allow us to innovate, that would allow us to advance or even invent new industries, new products, new services and systems. And, that was the way that it operated. And I think that what's happening, and this is, I think many educators would feel the same, that the invasion, if you like, the ideological invasion of higher education, and this is really, really true in the UK, if you layer up QAA, which is the quality assessment assurances, that people now that, education is a consumerist project rather than, I would say, a consciousness project. What you have is that all these standards, a bit like buying shoes, we have all the guarantees or a label on some baked beans, same principles, right? There's kind of like, needs to be some assurances about consistency across institution, but that, and also layer onto that validation criteria, etc. And then what you start to have is a worrying homogenization of what education does and is. And actually, I would argue that pushes it more towards operating as a kind of creche for grown-ups. We do not have jobs for young people, not just in the UK, but pretty much everywhere. So 16, 18-year-olds 50 years ago could have gone out and got a job, even if it was a manual, unskilled labor one. Now, if you don't have a degree, you're practically pariah in society. So we've made education has systematically been undervalued for so many years. The principal problem is that students are forced to just stay in education, whether or not they're academic or even interested in the topic, just because there's nowhere else for them to go. And I think that the issue is that's education is now this holding pen for a demographic who would.
Well, is that the fault of the education or the other side?
No, I think it's to do with the fact that education, as it doesn't operate independent of the infrastructure in which it's situated. By infrastructure, I'm talking about the political, and also I would suggest the economic infrastructure in which we are positioned. So we can't divorce ourselves of our responsibilities or our obligations to serve the bigger machine, because
so this is probably
education. Sorry.
Yeah, this is the notion of employability, presumably. This is the kind of obsession with employability in education.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I mean, I think, you know, Marko, what's so interesting to me is, and I'm guilty of this as much as anyone else, because of course I have to serve the machine, but, you know, employability, is a critical statistic for many schools. We are required to often keep tracks on student employment. We tout our employability, our graduate employability statistics, because obviously that's the things that in many ways is what parents need to hear, who are the principal investors now in education, having sacrificed their pensions in order to ensure their kids have a fighting chance of survival. So what's interesting is, of course, that those snapshots that constitute employment statistics, so what the finer calibration or the finer interrogation of what those statistics represent does not include how much kids are paid, whether they're being, you know, they're in really, really lowly paid or underpaid exploitation wage internships. It doesn't actually identify whether they've gone into a sector relevant to their career. And that's the stuff that schools don't tell you, because why would they? It'd probably be a bit scary for parents. But, you know, I think that one of the things I'm trying to do, and I know a lot of deans feel the same, and a lot of heads of school, not just a dean thing, I know that's more a US, is to really understand that, you know, we are at a situation now where the industry has been eating its young effectively for so very long through systems of unpaid internships and so on. I mean, just to finish the point I was making, this notion of what, you know, the obsession with producing employable people, I think that most of us now are moving toward trying to actually graduate employers, not just employees. So I'm setting up a business plan competition in my school that will allow students to be incubated in the school for 2 years after graduation, designing social innovation businesses. And for me, the social innovation dimension of that, it's not just, I don't just want a brilliant plan. It's about someone turning a facade detail into a wonderful corporate product for glass skyscrapers. I'm not interested in supporting that production, because that will happen anyway. I'm interested in giving students who have a serious commitment to social change and justice and climate issues the space in which to be supported for 2 years to develop a business that could, I think, push the boundaries of and the threshold of what architecture is, but also importantly, to come back to this point you raised of employment, when they graduate from the incubator that I'm setting up, that what they will be is capable of employing others. So they don't have to go through, get on the bottom rung of the ladder, which is currently the model, right? You graduate with full of ideas and talent and innovation, and somebody gives you a car park to detail. And I just think, what a waste of talent, what a waste of youthful energy. You know,
spent 3 years on a basement.
Yeah, and I think, and also with the, you know, the part 3 or the registration carrot being dangled a few feet ahead of you in order to make sure that you at least generate a surplus revenue for practice before they'll even contemplate letting you have a project that you could sign off as a part 3 project. And I think that's been going on for a long time. It's even why the AA, which is your alma mater and mine, we both studied there at different times. You know, it's why that was even set up. The whole point of that project was an angry 19-year-old and an angry 24-year-old saying, the tutelage system, which is how architecture was previously taught before it moved into the academic space, was literally exploitation. People would want to be an architect, and it was always men of money, of course, back then. And they would have to be hired as apprentices in practices or for architects who were much more, you know, who had these production houses. And it was at least a decade in order to get qualified. So the interesting thing, prior to Microsoft jumping on the bandwagon of the each one teach one methodology, is its traditions are not novel. You know, that was being done, you know, 150 years ago now, even longer than that. So I think that the autodidactic urge in architecture is definitely resurfaced. It's resurfaced because in many ways, there are dimensions of that in a lot of our curriculum now. I have a lecture series that's run by students. I have a student assistant to the dean. You know, I have a student council who make decisions on behalf of faculty in the school. And that's important to me. You know, it's the idea of giving people opportunities to experience academic leadership, because again, this question of employability, employed by whom and in what context. I believe that an architecture degree is a passport to any career. And it's why I stay within architecture. And it's why I advocate for architecture. It seems convenient, but I think that my epistemologicals measure up, because if you look at every other degree that you could do, none are as epistemologically rich as architecture. So I do think we are not leveraging that latency in our skill sets and really understanding its broader applications across society. But I think that's really, for me, one of the core preoccupations is kind of encouraging students, giving them space within their architectural education for far more speculation, to use architectural thinking to design business models, not just buildings, right? So what kind of business would they like to create? What would they want to, what kind of relationships do they want? You know, cooperative, less hierarchical, more community engaged, you know, what pay structures, etc., being different. I don't know, but that isn't something we do not give them the space to do. We teach them about what architecture practice is and how to succumb to it, not how to resist it and how to reimagine it. And I think that's a problem.
So do you think there is too much of a focus on design in architectural education? Do you think design is overrated?
No, I think that design is actually a system that rewards kinetic learners. So there's a theorist called Gardner who came up with a model of 8 forms of intelligence, and by my metric, and it's a very good lens to look through, in fact, there's a beautiful wheel that many people pedagogues have drawn. And of course, this 8 forms of intelligence thing is a reference for all, you know, people like me who've done PhDs in education, mad enough to do that, but also for other academics across the disciplines. But what it principally highlights is that education as is, and this isn't just higher education, this is you know, mainstream education, really rewards a certain kind of learner, and it's very hard often. And we've seen this in the UK now that we've had music education is no longer mandatory. It's been kicked out of the curriculum, which is a huge travesty. You know, Britain is one of, I think it is the world's leading music producer, of the most successful musicians and artists and everything else. And we are literally cutting our own creative throats and reconfiguring compulsory education. It's an absolute travesty. But what it does is it debilitates certain kinds of learners and actually destines them to fail, because if they're only being judged by 2 or 3 of those typologies of learning and they're not successful at it, it doesn't help them. So I've always been a kinetic learner myself. You know, I'm dyslexic, so actually I used to always draw, especially what I was listening to, rather than write notes, because I can store more information in an illustration than I can in a piece of text, and that's how I've always operated. And so there are all these techniques I had just from, in a way, trying to find workarounds for being dyslexic. How do I, you know, get a first-class degree? How do I get scholarships? You know, all these things where I had to figure out ways of doing it that relied on non-conventional ways of learning, memorizing stuff, practicing, and so on. And I think what's great about architecture is that design thinking, which, by the way, is really analyzed in a book by 2 academics called Bolland and Colopy, which is called Designing as Thinking. It very much looks at the idea that what we do is use our design intelligence, or use design as a thinking process to come up with far more creative, relevant and powerful outcomes. So I think that studio, of course, is essential, and I protect that for all I'm worth, because, you know, I think you have to really strike a balance between classroom-based and lecture hall-based learning and being able to make things. I think in fact, what I would argue is other disciplines are disadvantaged by the fact that they don't, for example, in poetry classes, in English literature degrees, encourage students to make their thoughts rather than write them before they even start to write a poem. I think there are all kinds of ways of thinking about the kinetics of learning, the process of making as a methodology for thinking, that we really, again, it's this thing about architecture education, not being able to, moaning about nobody valuing it, while at the same time not even being able to recognize what's valuable about itself. And these are the conversations we need to have.
I have a feeling that I've learned so much more after I've graduated. There is something within practice that is also kind of a learning process. And I just kind of wanted to kind of reflect on that notion that we should almost be also taught how to continue to educate ourselves. And actually that the kind of a role of an education is to almost tell us, first to teach us how to unlearn what we've learned and then kind of restart the learning process after we've been educated.
Yeah, that's true. I think that's a really interesting one. I mean, I think that, you know, one of the problems that we have, but I think architecture is exceptionally good at this, is you know, I think that because of, we talked about earlier about its inherent instability, and it's the collective lack of consensus over what architecture is and what it should do. Not to mention its let's just say identity crisis. You know, it's non-binary nature in a funny kind of way, right? It's the ultimate non-binary degree because it's neither one thing or the other, which I think is fantastic about it, and really what makes it in a way quite avant-garde. But I think it's that instability that allows far more criticality than potentially other subjects. So I think, you know, as you describe it, this notion of actually being able to, you know, be questioning, that's supported in architecture schools, I think, in ways that other disciplines may struggle. I think that you have to be fairly advanced in maths and physics in order to be able to contest some of the laws and the principles, right? But in architecture, I think there's so much more. From kind of year one, you can level a critique against the ideologies, the canon, the methodologies that characterize architectural production. And I think that's, in a way, what keeps architecture relevant, is because there's always that antagonism around what production is. You know, we've seen students work between mediums. One minute they're sculpting, next they're filmmaking, next they're animating, then they're, you know, they're using techniques that are more you would expect to see in a film studies degree rather than an architecture one. So they're very acquisitive. And I think that acquisition, that spirit of acquisition, is what disrupts all the time the way that we produce architecture, the way that we debate it, the way that we, I think, determine its futures. But I think that, you know, again, this point about when we have endless critique from industry saying we're not producing graduates who are relevant to practice, I think, you know, you're picking a fight with the wrong crowd here, because this generation are going to be what saves practice or maintains its relevance. What we do know from Future Trends data is that by 2035, something like 70%, well, some people say 85, but I think that might be a bit ambitious, but about 70% of the jobs that we'll be doing in the next 15 to 20 years haven't been invented yet. I mean, there weren't app developers 15 years ago, there weren't iPhone designers, right? So all the time these new technologies emerge, and whole sectors, you know, whole degree programs and whole disciplines converge around that particular product. So, you know, like games were invented. No one invented a game design degree thinking we all need games, right?
Yeah.
You know, game design as an industry created a need for very specific type of education. So the industry, you know, that's how it kind of worked, right? So I think it's interesting that, you know, all these things will emerge, a bit like rewilding. I'm just waiting for a university to offer a rewilding degree at some point, because what we've heard is that many of the future-proof careers are things like rewilding, because clearly we need to do that if we've got any bees left at this rate, given that we've lost half of them in just the last 20 years. So good luck with that. But you know, there's going to be a major food production crisis, which is, I think, one of the major consequences of climate collapse, which no one is really talking about. It's like, yeah, maybe people aren't feeling that affectionate towards starving penguins or drowning and starving polar bears, but when they can't eat an apple, then they might actually give a damn. And that's what's coming for all of us, unfortunately. And I don't know if synthetic food production is really there right now, or at least anywhere close to where it's going to need to be. But these jobs will emerge. They'll present challenges to all of us. And by implication, architects will have a responsibility toward them. And that, I think, is why, you know, we need to kind of see ourselves as architects of things rather than architects of buildings, like extend the boundaries and the definition of what architecting is. So it isn't just about spatial production.
So how do we become responsible? Because I have a feeling that, you know, we could end up having more kind of regulatory frameworks and even more institutional involvement in regulating the industry as a kind of striving towards inclusion, which you talk about, towards ecology that you talk about. You know, I guess we could easily drift into this situation where we're just again ticking boxes and we're just again kind of filling percentages. How do we avoid that? I mean, it's a kind of it's a real kind of change of consciousness that's necessary, rather than
I think, you know, maybe I'm slightly, I don't want to kind of go off into the sunset off your point, but if I could just zoom out slightly from it and make an ever so slightly different point, but it just, something you said provoked a thought about, you know, of this notion of like ticking boxes. I mean, it's a conversation I often have, and actually, and it really comes down to some of the work we're trying to do at Pratt regarding diversifying the curriculum, addressing Caucasian privileging, addressing canonic exclusion, which has obviously blighted architectural discourse history theory for some time. And also, I would say pedagogies, because we, you know, traditionally refer to Northern Hemisphere or Western pedagogies we see those as the pedagogies of choice, rather than looking at a far more expanded and inclusive view of what pedagogy is, to include other regions and other practices. But I think that, you know, one of the concerns that gets raised often in all kinds of formats, you'd be surprised, bit of trolling, direct emails, the odd snide comment, you know, the filters, that the channels of critique come in all different guises these days, don't they? And I suppose the criticism concerns the fact that there's a misapprehension that if we are trying to advance architecture and to do things differently, that we need to abandon everything that we ever did before. And that's always a concern for me. The assumption is that I just want a table or something that has no old white men on it. And I don't think that's true. I don't think anyone working to diversify anything is trying to exclude anyone. That's the kind of antithesis of inclusion, is to then exclude people. So that's often, I think, you know, the misapprehension. And I also think sometimes it's a false critique that is raised against, if you like, the left by the right. You know, and it's why you have Trump. It's why you have, you know, the rise of neo-fascism. So I think we need to keep returning to that conversation to offer assurances that that's not the project here. And similarly, to come then back from, you know, a spaceship perspective on your comment to your very specific comment, there will always be obligations, of course, to give people assurances that yes, this building won't fall down on you, and yes, our graduates are successful and employable or employing others or whatever. So I don't think we need to depart from metrics, but I do think we need to reconsider what metrics we rely upon. And I think at the moment, education and also architectural practice has, in many ways, and I would say in a very simplistic way, determined a set of metrics around what constitutes architecture that are very, very limited and constraining, and also fail to recognize the value we generate in other ways. So in education, because we ignore what happens to graduates, and this is the majority, by the way, of architecture graduates, we ignore what happens to them. If they don't practice architect, i.e. design and make buildings, we don't even include them in our community. We literally, you know, treat them like pariahs and they're ignored. We don't celebrate their successes. We don't celebrate the fact, for example, there's a Ghanaian admiral, a woman who went to architecture school. We don't celebrate the fact that Ice-T went to architecture school, or Courtney Cox out of Friends, or someone right now who's, you know, in Congress, you know, and other political leaders that we talk about in the book. And I think that's, for me, and Samuel L. Jackson, you know, just also thinking of champions. And it's like all these cool people are doing amazing things, like world-renowned, super famous, super talented. And we have never, ever made a claim about the fact that they belong. They are architects. They are architecting filmmaking. They are architecting acting. They are architecting, you know, naval ships.
Harriet, it might be that they escaped architecture. It might be that they're the ones that just couldn't bear it.
No, it's true though. That's the language we use, right? We see them either as having rejected architecture, they've escaped, or that they are, you know, they've abandoned. And that to me just sounds like, I don't know,
sinking ship.
Well, actually, it sounds like architecture needs therapy. It sounds like architecture's got unresolved issues from its childhood about, you know, who loves it. And I think that, you know, we need to kind of, and I say this not glibly actually, because I think that there are a number of people working in the space around discussions of care right now. And I think it's a really important part of all the conversations we need to have about architect's value, its purpose and everything else. Because I just think that we don't know how to care for ourselves. We don't know how to care for each other. We don't know how to use professions as caring enterprises, because capitalism can't function if there's care. That's the whole point. Capitalism relies upon fostering inequality to create rich people. By default, you have to create poor people, because there isn't, you can't have extreme wealth without creating extreme poverty. You can't have equal societies, because you need to create underclasses of people based on race or gender or sexual identity or ability, in order to, you know, again, being able to move the profit margins around. So, you know, capitalism and care are mutually exclusive. They don't go together. You know, I always find it really ironic that I have American health care. I just want to emphasize there's no care.
Well, I was just going to ask you to make a comparison then. I mean, how does, you did quite an extensive research on the pedagogical landscape in Britain, but how does the US compare, especially when you talk about capitalism? Surely it's far more brutal.
Yeah, I suppose the interesting thing is that Britain more closely resembles the US than it does Europe.
Yes.
So I think and obviously, you know, I've got an Irish passport. You're a European as well. So both you and I have got that kind of, you know, multi-location perspective on these differences. And I think that in Europe, you know, there has been, and what's been maintained is systems of taxation and so on that allow most education to be affordable. Highly affordable, if not free, in most cases. What America is doing, of course, in order to, because it's, you know, far more advanced in terms of capitalist production, is to disenfranchise young people by making the obligations they carry regarding their own education a financial burden that not only will last their lifetime, because the majority of student debt won't get paid off in the US, as we know, but also because that debt is hereditary. So in other words, kids in school right now, when they graduate and they get old, they can't afford houses, they delay having kids, so they have fewer, that, you know, they actually do more to damage economic activity than if they didn't have learning debt. So in a funny kind of way, all all education debt is actually borrowing against economic activity. So it's a zero-sum game, but it just allows a minority of people in this immediate window of time to become extraordinarily and needlessly rich at the expense of everybody else. But the lifetime debt thing is really important. So in England, if you get into debt and you die, it's not anyone else's obligation to carry it forward. In the US, if you die with learning debt, your children inherit your learning debt. So, you know, I mean, there are all kinds of slavery, and slavery, as you know, is a very sensitive topic, especially in the US, for understandable reasons. But, you know, slavery continues. There are several million, 120 million, in fact, slaves across the whole world right at this moment. So slavery isn't a historic project, it continues. And in fact, you know, I would say variants of it, like more dilute forms of slavery, really characterize what capitalism is, because it relies upon some people being willing to sell far more than their labor, by implication their ability to do other things, or, you know, other things they might want to achieve with their life, entirely to serve certain forms of economic production. So I think that in a way, America, a lot of economists are predicting that the next big economic collapse in America will be triggered by unpaid student debt. And I wouldn't be surprised. There's a phenomenal film, if you haven't seen it, called Ivory Tower. All listeners should watch this thing. I think it's on Netflix for $10. Oh, sorry, not to Netflix, YouTube, or maybe even on Netflix. But it's phenomenal, and it really gives you, it helps clarify just how that this project was. You know, it's finite. All of these initiatives, if you like, all of these engines of exploitation, they don't go on and on and on. You know, the resources are never finite. We know that about the destruction of the planet. We've always believed that we could just continue to treat the planet terribly. And of course, that's never going to be true. There's a finitude, if you like, to all of this exploitation. And it's the same with education. The system is unsustainable. At some point, it will break. But my suggestion, of course, and my view is that we try to preempt collapse, whether that's climate collapse, but also certainly education collapse, to protect the project that is education, i.e., a space for conceptualization, exploration, development on every level. But also the arena in which obviously learning takes place, but then so does imagining regarding what comes next, and a real crucible of opportunities for people to start thinking very seriously about how we address critical issues that face us, not delaying all of that engagement with those issues, but using the education forum as a space where we can engage through curriculum or pedagogic activities in those crises in the immediate sense.
I mean, it would be having the kind of capitalist educational framework. It is difficult to imagine teachers, educators empowering people to start a revolution, a kind of militant revolution. You know, I don't mean militant in terms of arms and kind of fighting and blood, but we kind of need a pretty militant, radical approach. And somehow I have a feeling that we would be expecting that to come from the educators, because you're kind of engaged in rethinking an educational framework within which you would generate that. Am I understanding that correctly?
I think that's definitely that's a good place to start the conversation, because I think that at the moment, I keep feeling, and it's something that really bothers me actually, is that we don't have time. So, you know, at the moment, for example, some students thinking, oh my God, architecture degree, 7 years minimum. And most people take far longer than that to complete their architecture education anyway, for all kinds of reasons, often increasingly economic reasons. But it's like, we've got to actually get students out there now. You know, there's a need to kind of get to mobilize. So, you know, maybe if we swap out militancy with mobilization, that works better for me, because I think that, you know, we don't have the time. It's not possible to continue to offer an education that takes this long to get people feeling that they can make a contribution. That in a funny kind of way, insisting that you're not able to architect anything unless you've subjected yourself to 7 years of training is kind of wrong in a way. It's about sort of kind of making, I think, coming back to this notion of binaries and silos and partitions, that they're kind of really starting to move the learning experience into the sites of the issue. So relocating outside of the campus into the community, or into the situations in which the problem needs to be confronted, and using that as the classroom, this sort of distributed classroom way of doing things. But I think that, you know, we've got, as you know, from London School of Architecture, these models that are putting students into practice from the beginning. And obviously that's, you know, a model that I think many schools would love to have, but it's quite a hard thing to support. If you've got a big student cohort, like a lot of universities, it works very easily with smaller student cohorts. But you know, that it's important that model is vital, because at the moment, in its fearless attempt to prototype something different. You know, it's going in a way going back to the traditions of the tutelage system, but doing so in a much more responsible way that protects students from exploitation. It means that students are learning what relevant skills to industry are in a far more immediate sense, but it's also allowing them through their, if you like, disappointments or their critique of what practice really is, to then bring that critique of those practice-based experiences into the education space and to think in a far more advanced and informed way about, you know, where the opportunities lie. And I think that's the problem. If we don't give students opportunities to connect to these kind of, you know, live situations now, and to rather than just do everything as a hypothetical, prototypical experiment, then I just wonder how, when they graduate, it's no wonder so many end up disillusioned and disappointed and then change industry. Because I think in some ways there's a bit of a miss sale here. We're giving students, we've been selling to students, and Dana Cuff makes this point brilliantly in her book, the Practice of Architecture, I think, and I'm definitely not quite, I think that's actually not the right title, but she makes a point about the primacy of the individual, which really is what architecture is. We overprivilege individual production within architecture schools, which of course, it's never going to take an individual production solution to address any of the problems we've got. So why do we then overprivilege that way of working when that's not what architecture needs and it's not what society needs? So I think, again, it comes back to that idea of reconfiguring education to make it, you know, again, resituate it, but also to make it more able to respond in a far more immediate sense, by bringing those immediate issues into the education space, or moving education space to the immediate issue.
Right, moving education space outside of the institutions, presumably.
Yeah, this you know, people, sometimes it's characterized as a redistributed classroom. Sometimes it's described as, you know, community engagement, you know, or community engaged scholarship. These are, which is, you know, Barbara Holland's scholarship talks a lot about community engaged scholarship. So these are pedagogies, methodologies that are, you know, most pedagogues, education theorists know about. There's nothing new. They're not necessarily something that even architecture has championed or does. You know, we talk about live projects, but that's, I think live projects now are not what we're talking about here. It's a far more direct and serious connectivity to critical matters. We're not talking about people building, you know, greenhouses on council estates in their flip-flops. You know, we're talking about very serious engagement in whether it's a political matter or an ecological matter, or even, you know, a segregation matter. All of the far more, you know, I think often the spatial solutions or the solutions that we need to entertain are not always spatial. They're not always about building being the band-aid, which is often how architecture education is taught. You can go out and save the world. We're going to teach you all about ecology and sustainability and a bit of politics, history, everything else. But then as long as you remember, folks, that the building is the band-aid to whatever the problem is, then, you know, here's a degree, off you go, thanks very much. And that's how we teach architecture at the moment. What we don't teach them is to think beyond the building, to imagine using architectural intelligence to manifest outcomes that are maybe immaterial rather than tangible, and that might be the more powerful and transformative strategy. Our fetishization of the building as objects, so this very sort of triple O in a way, isn't it? And which is, you know, a discourse which is fundamentally dominated by white male philosophers. So, you know, we need to move beyond that. I think that we've got to start looking at divorcing ourselves of our fetishization of building as object and move into something far more, I think, relevant and powerful. That's our opportunity, and it's one we're not utilizing.
Are there any practitioners around where you can see hope in terms of how they practice and what they're doing with the tools that the education's given them?
Well, yes. I mean, I'm not trying to do a sales pitch for my book, obviously, but Architects After Architecture, I mean, that's a whole catalogue of people who've taken ideas from architecture and applied them in different contexts, whether that's game design. So isn't it a lovely illustration, in fact, is, you know, the work of Miriam Bellard, who's worked with, you know, designing Grand Theft Auto, which obviously one would always assume that the game industry is just dominated by basically the grown-up version of spotty male teenagers eating Doritos in front of their parents' television, playing 12 miles at computer games. They're not a woman architect who ended up designing one of the coolest car-based games ever. So that's one example. Obviously, you've got Chris Hildrey with his proxy address project. You know, obviously he's doing really interesting work at looking at how, again, a dematerialized outcome. I mean, in obviously Miriam's work in Grand Theft Auto, there is a virtual space, but the car is the object, if anything, and there's obviously the architectural environment through which one traverses. But it's Chris's work, looking at how do you give a virtual address to homeless people in order to create a means through which their status as homeless is concealed, in order to get them the job interviews that they need to change their circumstances, and in order to get them access to benefits and care. That system is hugely radical and could transform the lives of thousands upon thousands of homeless people in the UK. And we've got rather a lot, as you know, but it's a critical issue now. And under the current government, very little hope of anything being done to help them for at least the next term of office. So I think that, that's a spatial solution, of course. Both of those examples use space, and they rely upon a highly advanced understanding of spatial systems, infrastructure, and so on. So all of the skills you're taught in design studio, not just history theory, right? But of course, the outcomes are, intangible. The impact, however, is truly tangible. It's life-changing. So I think that's where architecture, again, in just those two illustrations, and we've got a ton of outstanding illustrations in the book. They just show the way that we need to think more expansively, and I think that is really where the conversation should shift to.
Do you think that after this pandemic, which coincides with Brexit, actually, there will be a kind of an awakening, a change of consciousness, and a kind of years of at least revolutionary activity in terms of changing paradigms in our approach to design, art, architecture, anything. Well, the way we've seen after the Second World War with modernism.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I mean, I think at this point, Marko, I'd really like to invite you to answer that question a little bit, because, one of the things I always find a bit intriguing about interviews is, so I've known you now a decade, and when I met you, you were bashing your head against the wall of a very limited brief, and your frustrations, prompted you to migrate to an institution that was far more accommodating of radicalism and progressive thinking. So I just, I think that's a good question. It'd be really interesting to hear your response, and also because, as you know, I'm profoundly non-hierarchical and often find the conceit of it all being about me in these interviews somewhat frustrating.
I mean,
I'd like to hear more
thanks
about
for
you.
asking. No, but what's interesting, and I think somehow a lot that you said somehow feeds into exactly what I'm trying to do and the kind of direction I'm taking, and that is why I really wanted to talk to you anyway. But what I've done after 5 years in practice, I kind of felt like I have to stop and kind of take a step back and just assess kind of personally myself. I mean, that's one thing I don't recognize in the architectural profession. There isn't really emphasis on the individual. I was never really deeply encouraged to look inside and try to express, well, even if it is a language, even if it is a kind of informal sense architectural language. So I really felt that urge, because I have the kind of creative urge. I kind of had to kind of step back and look at the profession, and then think about what I want to do and what I want to express. And so about 2 years ago, I really started developing an artistic practice, a practice which is not in any way political, but it allowed me to manifest a certain creativity that I felt was oppressed within the framework of the kind of professionalism within architecture. And so that's what I'm doing, and so I personally feel that as a consequence of this, let's say, year and potentially another year of introspection that I hope that a lot of the world will go through, the result will be an awakening in terms of I guess challenging what's prescribed and what is kind of expected and kind of constructed for us, and again, just this kind of questioning of looking inside and seeing what is the territory that I can contribute in a way. And I'm not saying contribute in a kind of a socialist manner at all, but I just feel that, if you're happy, if you're not happy in a kind of walking around the street, jumping around and with a balloon in your hand, but if you're encouraged you will be a more useful member of a community, of a society. I do believe in architecture. I mean, I think having stepped away from it and explored areas such as art, fashion, design, I must say that I have rediscovered an admiration for the architectural profession. I often felt that it's very slow. It takes a long time to build a building. You know, it takes 3, 4, 5 years to build a building. And I felt other creative professions are far faster and able to generate much more ideas. So that this was one of my kind of main critiques of the architectural profession. But having stepped away from it and now looking at it again and generally believing in it, I think that there is also something good in the kind of meditative slowness of it. So, you know, I just feel that we just need to kind of break boundaries between, not kind of everyone does everything, but we need to be able to see and value the slowness. You know, there is so much superficiality in fashion. There is so much kind of unnecessary sexualization for the point of just profit, really. And not for any artistic particular reason. So, you know, I think there are issues on every side, and I think we kind of maybe just have to see things in other areas of creative production that we need to begin to value and to kind of maybe re-examine our own area, domain, through others. I don't know if that answers
Yeah, there
question,
you go. Well, frankly, that's a manifesto. I think, isn't that interesting? Because you could, in a way, transpose that into a business plan. You could transpose that into, you know, a thesis, and I like that. You know, and you talk about the fact that, and I thought one of the most important things you just said was that without the proximity to architecture, it's only when you step back from it could you really value what its contribution is. I think in a funny kind of way, that's quite you know, Henri Giraud talked about that. He talked about the critical periphery, notion that we never really can understand anything if our proximity to it is too intimate. So I think in a way we need to do more of that, and I think that's where pulling students out of taking away the comfort blanket of designing buildings and actually saying take those skills now, you know, and actually use your design thinking to solve other problems is super important. You know, and I don't think we do that. We need to embed that in education. And then, of course, when you graduate, you realize the world really is your oyster. And I hate that phrase. And I also like the fact that oysters should remain in the sea and not be eaten, because I'm a vegan, as you know. But it's like still as a metaphor.
I do remember you're vegan.
Oh, yeah. I like to make sure everybody knows that we all need to become vegan in order to save the planet. I'm just speaking factually and statistically here. So this is not propaganda. This is a statement of absolute statistical fact. Very important to remind ourselves from time to time. But yeah, so I think, you know, the issue for me is that we don't, because we don't do that, we don't understand, we don't encourage enough separation from, you know, distance from what architecture is as it is at the moment, that we find it very hard to, you know, kind of reconfigure our relationship with it in many ways. I suppose often, you know, important relationships are better after a breakup.
Yes.
So maybe we all need to divorce architecture and then remarry. I don't know.
Yeah.
But I think there's a system there that we need to confront around, again, the pedagogic limitations, because, and I'm so sorry to say this in a podcast, but you know, since you've had my dogs barking, my friend picking my dogs up, bringing them back, and now you've got me telling you that I've got to go to a senior management meeting 10 minutes ago. You know, one of the things I find really interesting about architecture is, or at least, you know, the conversation we're having here is that, you know, at the moment we don't really seem to have an ability to understand its relevance to the design of our everyday lives. So, you know, it's like, look at how we're living right now. Look at what the pandemic means for people. Architects are more interested in describing post-pandemic design of buildings than they are in actually doing anything to ameliorate what people are currently going through. So we know we've got a mental health crisis that's pretty much a silent killer that kills thousands upon thousands of people every day. We're not having that conversation in architecture. We're not really understanding that there are, even when we are confined, ways that we can rethink, you know, spatial environments if we want to go down that route, but also systems of exchange, systems of community that transcends the materiality, you know, in a way that the architecture of COVID is almost, it's kind of, you know, it's been designed, right? If we think that architecture is buildings, the architecture that we haven't yet designed for COVID are the systems that move beyond the physical constraints, that move beyond the geographical limitations of all being, you know, stuck indoors. So I think that, you know, again, architecture should be leading a conversation about how we live differently, even though we're segregated from each other spatially. That's still a spatial problem. And again, we just don't understand how to have that conversation. But yeah. And one last thing to say before I bounce. Sorry, it's a phrase I've inherited from being here for too long now. So forgive the Americanisms that every now and again surface and scare both of us, I believe. You know, is that we have to understand that when we talk about retention and continuation of students, and this is certainly true of students from diverse backgrounds, you come into architecture school, it's, you know, you're taught the architecture of 4 white men principally in year 1, and if not year 2, you know, Corbusier, Van der Rohe, etc. And the problem with that is that, of course, when you don't see yourself in the curriculum, then how do you see yourself as necessarily being valued by what you're being taught, or even to see that there's a place for you in the profession? So when we say, oh, it's all industry's fault that education doesn't work because we're all laboring under the misapprehensions of industry and the limitations of industry. But, you know, we have retention rates in schools, right? We have issues with being able, what we do know, and this is statistical fact, is that, you know, disproportionate numbers of diverse, I guess in the US, UK, we call it BAME students. In the US, we call it BIPOC. And also women, female students, more leave architecture than white men. So, and that's that's in education. So we can't always blame practice. Yeah, we can grumble about long working hours and how that disadvantages mothers as well as fathers for that matter. But you see what I mean? I think that pedagogy is implicated just as much as practice. And so I think that, you know, this conversation about moving to the margins isn't something that you did it. You know, I think you were advanced in the sense that you did it when we were, you know, when I was your tutor and you were my student. And, you know, you found yourself on the boundary of what you were being asked to do. And that was an unstable place for you. So, you know, and that was a really healthy place to be. But a lot of students just want to get an A. They just want to get through. They've got all this learning debt. So they want to conform because they're terrified about taking risks, because they're not just risking passing, they're risking huge amounts of debt. So it's like the stakes are so high when you add in that monetary pressure. So I think that is reducing students' ability to really speculate and experiment.
Exactly.
So it's unfortunate.
And ability to protest.
Yeah,
to revolutionize, to be revolutionaries, I guess.
Yeah, and we shouldn't be scared of the notion of revolution. I mean, radical means root. You know, we know this. We know that it's about going back to some of the core ideas of what we think we are, and maybe just critically rethinking them. Coming back to where the first part of our conversation today, where we talked about, you know, being able to do that. But I also think, you know, revolution is actually not to necessarily reject a set of values. It's to renew them. So it's, in other words, to renew anything. It's a bit like, you know, Blockbuster Video, right? You kept renewing your membership until one day we no longer have VHS. So it's about that renewal cycle isn't about an abandonment of
terms of engagement. Yeah,
it's about revisiting whether they're relevant or not, and reconfiguring a sense of momentum, which is what every revolution is. It's an energetic force field. It's moving in a particular way towards a set of objectives, but in order for it to move, the momentum that drives it is a constant critique of a certain set of values, and a reconfiguration and reapplication of their relevance, and of course, often simultaneously, an absorption of new ideas and new concepts and new ways of doing things. So I think that, you know, that we need to kind of be less frightened of these terminologies, which frankly modern capitalism has encouraged us to be fearful of, in the same way it's encouraged us to be fearful of socialism, and yet America's always been deeply socialist. It has been, just doesn't, it's kind of got that kind of identity crisis, a bit like, you know, being gay. It hasn't come out of its socialist closet ever. Actually, America, it's starting to happen a bit more, but it's that same problem. You know, it's that kind of like we believe in all those values. We believe in having access to healthcare, education, you know, certain values in the US that characterize, I would say, some loose sense of national values, because obviously these things are hard to achieve with such a big landmass and millions of people. But, you know, it's very interesting to sort of think of the idea of actually having that as part of the project here, just that ability to sort of say, okay, we are going to move this forward by at first recognizing that everything we stand for isn't bad, that it's not about wholesale rejection of everything, but it is about a critical reevaluation of what matters, its utility, and potentially whether or not its current application is the right place. So as an illustration of that, you know, if we look at the jet engine, you know, the jet engine was obviously invented for aerospace, but some bright spark decided if you put it in a domestic environment and call it a washing machine, it reduces domestic labor, mostly for women. So we call that, you know, a transdisciplinary application of a technology, but in a way architecture can do that. It can do that internally, not just returning to our conversation earlier about moving into different industries, but we can think again about the skills we are learning when we're teaching student history theory. Is the right application or the right pedagogy for understanding whether they understand history and theory to ask them to write an essay? Why not ask them to, you know, go out and build a model or work with a community? Do you see what I mean? I often think that the things we teach and then the methodologies and the pedagogies we use to assess them are incongruous. So I think that, again, it comes back to the architecture by definition needing or being defined as disruptive, and which is why it's surviving, frankly. And despite the fact it's poorly paid and all these other issues everyone grumbles about professionally, why do we still have students applying for it all the time? I think instinctively they know that this gives them a whole confection of possibilities. But you know, that kind of disruptiveness is being, I think, or it is often really curtailed within schools, and that's an ongoing problem. So, you know, embrace revolution, embrace radicalism, embrace criticality, and that's where I think we can start to have a far more meaningful conversation about how we make education far more active. It's not a kind of prototype environment. It should be very much about providing, in a very immediate sense, what solutions to